Alright guys and gals, what we're going to do tonight is talk about how the coolant temperature gauge works on a 94 to 96 Impala SS or Caprice. And here in front of me I have the factory service manuals. So taking a quick look at the schematics here, this is the update, by the way. This is not the original ones underneath it. This is the this is the update book and electrical diagnosis section. So schematic shows here. Here's your gauge. It picks up a signal from the temperature sensor here. 1365, so 1.3 k ohms is 100 degrees. 55 ohms is 260 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the ground. That's reference to ground. Goes up here, goes into the gauge. The gauge needs to pick up another ground reference signal here. It ties in here and then goes to A6. It also picks up a positive signal from A11. And so you basically need A4, A5, A11, and A6 to get the gauge to work. So let's come over here. Oh, before I do that, here's what is inside of one of the gauges. So basically it's like a motor. That's what I'm going to call it because I see some some windings in there. And the needle just kind of spins freely on here. It can just spin around in circles. There's no spring on set and how it works. Here's what a cluster looks like, half apart. So we're talking about this gauge here. And there's the full cluster again. We're working on this gauge here. All right, so here's our gauge cluster ready to be hooked up to a power supply. Looking on the back here, you have to bear with me. There's a little bit of a mess here because I'm just trying to prop this up on a toolbox, random toolbox here. But there's our 4 connections. So 2 hot connections. Those are the 2 red wires. The blue wire is going to be your gauge input signal, and the black wire is going to be your ground for the power. And what I have here is a potentiometer, or a pot for short, and that is wired up to the negative pin here, the ground from my power supply wires. So it's a white jumper, yellow wire comes out of that jumper and goes into the blue wire, which went into the back of the gauge as your temperature sensor input. I think this is a 10K pot, and I'm gonna show some behaviors here with how these gauges work. Resistance, 1.6 k ohms resistance. This gauge will not read anything above it. Once you go above that, it'll just sit at cold. And I'll show you that in a minute. So, whoops, the wire came off the pot here. Let me fix that. All right, the white jumper wire came off. So here's my power supply. Just turn it on, and there's the gauge having power. You'll notice that the gauge is reading C, and volts is reading kind of high, so I'm going to turn that down just a hair just to get us where we need to be. So that's about normal operating voltage, maybe a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so that's about normal on a voltage gauge, and our temperature gauge is showing, where I would expect to see it, sitting at C. Now, what happens if I take the pot out of the circuit? So here's the pot. You know, a lot of people would think, oh, if I take that out, I bet my gauge is going to drop further because there's no longer any resistance on there. So let's try that. All right, so that's what happened. It only dropped a tiny, tiny bit. On a completely open circuit, it's still not reading below C. And let me reattach that. Sorry about the terrible camera. I'm just holding the darn thing. Okay, so now we're back to having the pot hooked up to the circuit. And I will demonstrate now what happens when I turn that pot. So this is simulating what the sensor would do. So this is all the way, if I turn, this is a 10K pot. If I turn this pot all the way down to nothing, so that would be the 10K point, it's still sitting at C. You saw earlier, just a few minutes ago, I disconnected the white jumper, and it still sits at C. So there is no case where the sensor could be bad, or disconnected, or the wire broken leading from the sensor that would cause the gauge to ever read below C. It's biased at C with the power on. And I could also further explain that by shutting the power off. And you can just move this gauge, and it'll kind of want to go in different places. See? It'll just do random things wherever you want to leave it. Okay? So it's freely moving. But when you turn the power on, boing, it bounces back to C. I could sit here and play with it, and it'll always return to C now. It is being biased, and even if I unhook that pot, let me do that again because I wanted to demonstrate that. So the pot's unhooked, and watch, our needle will still always return to C. It is electrically biased to always return to C right now. And with no power on, power off, it'll it's much more, it's much less decisive. There's a little bit of magnetism or something in there that's kind of wanting it to go back sometimes, but no, look, it's just flopping around, really. I don't know. But this will not happen. Let me turn the power back on. Boink, goes right back to C. And right now, my jumper's still disconnected from that pot. Right now, you're getting nothing to that. Here's the blue wire that goes into the back of the gauge, going to the pot and going nowhere from there. It's just it's just disconnected. So let me show you what the bulb test does. So the bulb test sends a strong ground signal straight to the and I can show you that on the schematic. It sends a straight ground straight to the gauge. So hold on, I'll show you that on the schematic. Alright, so here's the schematic. Here's the bulb test. There's your ground signal there. When you hit the bulb test position on the key right before the start position, it'll send a straight ground right into this circuit right up to the gauge. So it literally nails the gauge right into ground. So that would be our bang, bang, bang. Now notice every time I do that, the gauge kind of falls a little bit further below. It just goes, it's moving. See, it's returning to a different spot every time because it's just spinning on the gauge is spinning. The needle, is either the shaft is spinning on the armature or the shaft is spinning on the needle. Either way, it doesn't quite ever come back to where it should. And every violent hit throws it off even more sometimes, depending upon how many times this has happened. So if I do this enough, it should really get out of whack. Yeah, there you go. So as you can see, this is definitely a bad gauge.